Well, good morning again. I hear lots of good discussion of various things, people talking and that kind of thing. We're going to go ahead and everybody be quiet down. I know that's a lot. So we're going to hear you and talk about everything. Come on, be quiet. Everybody go ahead and get sat down. We're going to get started in the Bible study first. Thank you. I don't listen. That's all right. You have a question?
He's one of those things that the teachers do.
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry, what? I don't know what you're talking about. I can't. No.
Okay, so last week I mentioned about the thesis study that if you watch these more than 60 minutes, it can start to affect you psychologically. The clarification is if you watch the same thing, like 15 more than 20 minutes of pandemic scenes, or more than 20 minutes of the war in Ukraine, it would start to affect you in your anxiety and your fear. So I wanted to clarify that. So just watching 15 minutes of the 65 weeks isn't going to make you go like that.
Well, thank you. That was my mother, yes. So the thing I want to do to start today is how many of you remember the question I left with you at the end of last week of homework to do this week? Over this past week. What homework? Daryl says. For those, can everybody quiet down just a second? I'm sorry, but the thing I want to ask you again over this past week is how many of you took time as you consumed whatever kind of media that you're consuming and thinking of that question in your mind about what's important that we know? And was anything that you're consuming just for the sake of somehow gaining more knowledge, and that gaining more knowledge was important? Or did you take time to think about it in the sense of how is this information, whatever it is that's getting presented, whatever it is that I'm consuming, how is this actually helpful that I would need to know this information? Anybody spending time doing that, or did anybody have any thoughts quick to share about if you did that over the course of this past week and what it felt like, if it seemed different? It's okay if you didn't. I'm just curious. Yeah, Diana. So was that helpful for you, or is that a good thing, or is that? Stu, yeah. Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Oh, fair enough. Yeah.
So you're actually smarter today than you were at this time last week. Only with numbers. That'll work.
Well, I think at least for diving into today, I think that brings up an interesting point that I didn't make last week, and I know I said last week at least that I wasn't asking you to consume media differently. I wasn't asking to do that. I know I joked with, I think maybe it was Rick on, and he's not here today, but I joked with this as we were going into this kind of study that I hoped I wouldn't sound like the guy that's standing on his porch yelling at people to get off my lawn. that you'd somehow think that like we don't need to be on our phones, or that you don't need to be on Facebook, or you don't need to consume media, because I think it is important that we're engaged in the world.
So I did do the part where you say, how you ask the question, how is this going to help me live my life for Christ today? And the fact of the matter is, though, as I'm going through my week and I'm consuming all of this stuff, It's not that I wasn't on it. I'm not on social media so much anymore, and I actually feel better because I think it was starting to mess with me a little bit. But just any kind of media, even just mainstream news media, asking that question, how does this help me to live my life in Christ today, actually helped me to know to check something and go, okay, so that's going on in the world. And then I really didn't think about it quite as much, honestly, because if it doesn't serve for my faith walk, it was actually easier to put down. So I'll go ahead and put myself out there and say, I actually did this exercise, and I found it hugely helpful just to ask the one question, how is this going to help me live my life for Christ today? Because a lot of times the answer was it's not, or in some tangential way, but it did make it easier to not keep on it, just check it and then put it down.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I guess an example that comes to my mind from last week is I got up in the morning and I turned the news on, and for the first 5 minutes it was all about inflation.
Yep.
And I just out of like how much tolerance I have for all that, I thought, no, I don't want to listen to that. And I turned it to him. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Why don't I want to hear about it? Don't I trust God to hear me? Am I not worried about prices and money that I can't hear about the economy? So I turn it back on.
Yeah. I liked it. I mean, that's awesome that God put that in your heart, that your mind, that to remind you of the first commandment that, yeah.
I shouldn't be. Turn it back on.
Because he's going to give you everything you need every single day. Tiffany.
So I get this email with my news. It's called the Skim News, and I find that it's really nice for me because, like, it skims the news and then gives like a paragraph of kind of big things going on in the world that is linked to anything. So, like, if I really feel like I need to be more involved in something, or if I really feel like that's something I don't know a lot about, and I want to have a conversation with someone, I can click on the link and read more. But it's nice to just, like, sometimes you can wrap up a lot of information. Because I feel like getting a lot of information, but not diving into it.
Good stuff. So I think for today, we're going to dive into a little bit more stuff. Just kind of, again, laying some of the groundwork. The principles was the word I used last week. Principle number one of, if I can get this to work, there it goes. Principle number one of what do you need to know? So that's a little bit what we were just discussing, at least from last week to this week, of, how is it important in the sense of what you need to know to walk as a child of God, as a disciple of Christ. For today, I've got two more. We'll see if we get through both of them this week. But I've got it up here. It says algorithms in an echo chamber. I've got a video I want us to watch here in just a moment, and then we can kind of discuss it a little bit. But the points that I've got up here, just news feeds, social media feeds, that they're designed to give you more of what you like or what you're used to. And lots of times, I mean, this is definitely true of Facebook. This is definitely true of Twitter. This is definitely true of Google even. All the different things that you're connected to electronically, they're constantly mining your data, mining what kinds of things you might click on, mining what kinds of things you might read, mining data about just trying to understand who you are. There's a documentary called The Social Dilemma, and the metaphor that they use with this is specifically with your phones and your devices is like you're a voodoo doll, and all these companies are constantly looking for ways to poke and prod you to get you plugged back in and get you consuming things that are ultimately directed to advertisers. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but I think this is important in that question of, what do you need to know, and how is this, whatever knowledge that I'm getting and as I'm consuming media, how is this helpful for me as a disciple of Christ? What do I need to know to live my walk of faith? Is to know that sometimes you're going to get a really narrow perspective of a full picture of a story, because it's going to be tailored to the things that you typically like to hear. And it's not going to necessarily give you a broad context of a story, a broad context of an issue, of a broad context of the nature and why something might be happening. And this could be true from a whole number of different things, from politics to things like the economy that we discussed a moment ago, to geopolitics in Ukraine. Very often, however you interact with electronic media is going to be filtered in a way that you get a very narrow picture of a full perspective, typically speaking, just because of how they're actually utilizing algorithms and other things to funnel information to you that they think that you want, that you like, that you want to know. And again, the last point, it just makes it, I think, that much more difficult, or that you have to be that much more cognizant of this idea as you're trying to just discern. And even going back to that Romans 12 idea last week of not conforming your mind to the pattern of this world, but by prayer, that you're trying to discern what God's will is. If you're trying to be engaged in the world, living as a disciple of Christ in the world and not of the world, that how much more difficult that makes it, or just, you really got to think hard about why this particular piece of information might be getting presented to you, whether it's an email news alert, whether it's a social media feed, whether it's a Google piece, whatever it happens to be. Let's take just a moment. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to make my computer work, and we'll watch this video quick. So I think I know how to do it. Do you want to turn it down over there if it's super loud?
We surround ourselves with people we agree with, and the internet has only made it easier. For many, Twitter is a place to have existing views reinforced. Often without realizing it, a lot of us choose to live in an echo chamber, a place where it can seem like everyone on Earth is just like us. And Facebook? Well, Facebook takes it even further. Of course, you can hide those posts from your Google, but Facebook actually does a lot of that work for you behind the scenes. It knows what you like and what you comment on, what brands you follow, what ads grab your attention, events you're attending, and publications you read. Facebook uses all that data to feed its algorithms. Those algorithms choose what you see. And if you know where to look, you can actually see what Facebook thinks you like, your interests, your hobbies, and even your political views. The result is what's become known as the filter bubble, where your timeline is filled with opinions you share. Facebook actually makes money off knowing those things. They sell you and your filtered bubble to advertisers. Those advertisers will pay more to get their products in front of people that are likely to buy them. And if you're seeing things you like, you'll spend more time on Facebook, seeing more ads, and making the company more money. Because the bubbles keep us well informed, it's a tough question to answer, especially while the technology is still changing so fast. But one thing's for sure, that technology has the power to make us more connected or more isolated than ever.
I got to switch back to the other screen here quick. All right, so as you watch that, and at least the kind of front porch of the context I gave to it, and we think about kind of what that means, kind of a couple questions come to mind for me. You know, one is, have you seen things like this in your life? If you're on, whether it's, I mean, it talks a lot about Twitter and Facebook, the video does. But again, this is true in many other examples of electronic communications and that kind of thing. If you've seen examples of this in your life, and then thinking about tying principle one into principle two, you know, how is this inform us, or what kinds of ways do we need to be discerning and have our eyes open for, again, that question of how is this information that I'm potentially consuming or that I am consuming helpful for me to know as a disciple of Christ, and how is it helpful in the sense of how I'm actually living out my faith and what God's called me to do. Everybody's wheels are still turning a little bit, I think, maybe. I see a hand, maybe. I can't. Yep.
One of the things that I thought about when I was watching is as I scroll through Facebook and I see an ad, I never click on it, but I think I'm interested, and so I go and search and find out that and that was kind of a shocker for me, because I used to click on it. Now I don't anymore, because I don't trust it.
Sharon.
You know, listening to that and thinking about things you have said, see, I like it. I'm getting things that are Christian and getting things that I talk to people that feel like I do. But maybe that's not all good, you know? Because they're doing that. I knew they were doing that. But, and for me, that's a blessing. Like my sister gets all this political stuff. Well, I don't get any political stuff. And I like that, but maybe that's not the best.
Well, Sharon's highlighting an interesting point, if everybody could hear her, but she's commenting that, you know, at least on her Facebook feed, maybe she's protected from, she mentioned her sister gets a lot of political stuff and she doesn't get the political stuff. And maybe there's an aspect that she likes the idea that most of what she's seeing is Christian or common with what she'd like to believe, but also then she's raising the question, is that really good? Is there a moment where maybe it would be helpful to see a broader perspective? Shane.
I think not only just in social media, but also our friend groups. You know, if I'm completely honest, most of the people I hang out with are middle-aged Lutheran white males. But that also means I'm not doing my God-given responsibility for going out and engaging other people and sharing the word with people who aren't exactly like me.
Yeah. Everybody hear that all right? I mean, Shane just admitting that even just with the friends he hangs out with, that most of them are very similar to him. I don't know if y'all remember, at least I talked about this a little bit last week with my Twitter feed and using this kind of as an example of, I don't know what this says about my Twitter feed now as we say things that you like, but I used the example last week when I was on my Twitter feed and I was reading through a post and then a bunch of comments that it was about abortion. And it was various folks that were misappropriating scripture to seemingly justify why God would not say abortion is wrong. And I talked about it from the standpoint of how that was helpful for me. I thought, at least in the sense of gaining a perspective of somebody that was completely different than me, looks at scripture completely different. You know, I had no idea whether or not these people were believers, what their actual perspective in life was. But maybe if one day God puts me in a spot to talk to someone that maybe is in a similar spot, or is, you know, adamantly pro-abortion, adamantly willing to use scripture that way, or maybe even somebody that's just struggling with it, to gain a perspective that's outside my own bubble, maybe, about then God using that little bit of information, that little bit of perspective, that maybe it's helpful in the sense of how I could share who Jesus is and what I know to be true because of how God's revealed himself. Harlan.
With the abortion issue, one thing that happened this last week, Governor Ricketts appointed this North of Omaha as the new senator, and she's a pro-life advocate. So, and more, and I guess the vote for that abortion situation is very close, and so another person on that side of the ledger is really helpful.
Yeah, Harlan was just talking about abortion and that Governor Ricketts just appointed a new senator up in Omaha this last week. And recognizing that even in Nebraska, they had a vote earlier this year on a bill related to Roe v. Wade, and it fell 2 votes short, and this would put them 1 vote closer, assuming that everyone still voted the same. Any other thoughts about this idea as you're consuming electronic media and recognizing again that what's getting driven to you is primarily driven to you because of what you like, and it's primarily, as it said, for the purpose of driving you to advertisers. It isn't about necessarily an altruistic notion of what you need to know or what's important for you to know, and how you look at those things with the perspective of having the lens of your faith on, and how is this helpful for yourself as a Christian and in your walk with Christ. Jennifer, yeah.
Sometimes, I guess, when I'm reading something on my phone, I end up going to more than one source because I feel like, okay, this is telling me this, but that can't be all of, so I'll check like 3 or 4 different reports or news articles or something like that for the same thing. And you find out, oh yeah, there's a little bit more to that. And that's not the whole story. And okay, here's this and here's this, and now it is relevant.
Yep. I think that's a really good point, Jennifer, just for everybody is checking more than one source. You see whatever it is on your Facebook feed, and then you pull out of that to think, okay, I want to dive into that a little bit more. I do think this is important for me to know in my walk of faith. How can I learn a little bit more detail about what's actually going on and looking at multiple sources? Daryl, did you have your hand up? Or
yeah, I was just going to say, of course, I'm probably bad on this because I don't use social media just expressly because I know that all the companies have agendas, and I know what they do with the data and how they get the data. So I basically avoid social media. But even just your standard news, these articles are written with an agenda. The writer has an agenda, he's leading you to a conclusion. He's trying to direct you a certain way. So instead of when I was young, I remember more facts being presented as facts, not editorials. Now we have a lot of editorials that are trying to lead you to certain conclusions or lead you to a certain thought process.
Yep. Everybody here, Daryl, all right? Okay. Carol.
I have a grandson that likes to look at podcasts, and I fear that you look at a podcast, when you're young and stuff, and you think everything is true.
Unless it's the 1.5 Pastors podcast.
And Mark's house.
Vaughn.
I'd just like to comment a little more on Daryl's comment too, because I don't do social media either, but we're kind of like throwbacks and we still watch like network news.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of struck by the coverage of this leaked opinion from the Supreme Court that might overturn Roe versus Wade. And even though the people are not actually putting it into words, you can just feel this undercurrent. And while they're reporting this, that in their mind they're thinking, how could they even think of doing something like this, taking away people's rights? Oh my God, And you can feel that while they're reporting this. So you can just tell how slanted the coverage is.
Well, I think it's absolutely true, and it actually kind of Vaughn and Daryl, you're both kind of helping me tee up principle number 3, and I think we'll get started on that. We won't finish it today, so we're actually going to finish it. Let me think. It'll be not next week, but the week after. I'll tell about next week in a minute, but because principle number 3 that I want to get into really dives into this idea, and it's going to take more time than we have tonight or today, but we'll start with it. But it is the fact that even if you take a step outside of social media and you look at just news media generally, and maybe I'll show this clip at some point. I don't have it ready today, but even if you're talking local network news, the ownership and the way that it goes up to corporations. There's this clip that I have where you can, and it's just this series of cut-ups and people reading word for word the exact same reporting on a bunch of different local stations all over the country. And it's because it's written by somebody in some corporate office and wherever the corporate headquarters is. And here's what you need to say about this issue. So let's move into principle number 3. And this is, I love this stuff, by the way. I don't know if anybody knows this, but I'm really excited to talk about this next piece. So we're going to talk about news media and just media generally as propaganda, frankly. And the way I want to dive into this is the propaganda model and mass media. And what I've got up here, there's 5 filters. This idea of the propaganda model actually comes from Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. If you Google Noam Chomsky later today, you'll discover that he's about as left as you can get politically, which I'm guessing most of you in this room are not there, but he's about as left as you can get politically, but he's also a PhD MIT scholar in linguistics and communications. And the things that he writes in terms about communications and linguistics are fascinating. So if you stay away from his politics, he's really fascinating. And basically this whole idea of the propaganda model is stuff that he did with Edward S. Herman. And it really ties into this whole idea of media as propaganda, and that the goal of media, frankly, is about making money, yes, but also just about getting us to conform and getting us to consent to whatever, you know, the powers that be would have us, how they want to have us live. And Daryl, I know you made the comment, obviously there's much more editorializing in the news than there was maybe when I was a kid, or maybe however many years ago. But I'd also argue that this notion is definitely true going back to maybe Edward R. Murrow, which would be 1950s. It's been around for a long time, this notion of it. It's grown significantly because of the numbers of stations and cable news, and, you know, again, social media. The amount of information we have in front of us now versus the 1950s or even the 1980s is significantly different. But this idea still holds true, and in some ways it holds true even more because of how much it's been accelerated. But within his propaganda model, he has these 5 filters to really think through. And this again gets to that question of, as you're consuming media, what am I really seeing? How is this helpful for me to know? But then this is also thinking about the context of why this is getting presented to you. And if you're really thinking about that, again, with the lens, the mindset of your faith, knowing that your identity is first and foremost in Christ, the whys these are getting presented to you also, I think, then again fits in with these first 2 principles. So again, you've got them up there. 5 filters of the model: size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media, funding through advertising, sources, flack, and common enemy and use of fear. So we're going to kind of spend more time on them?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's all I'm going to say about that. Is that if I can get my computer to work. Well, I thought it was. All right. Well, let's spend a little bit of time on the size, ownership, and profit orientation of the mass media. And the reality here is that, you know, I mentioned the idea of even local news being this way, where you're going to have very similar things read all over the country, written. But the first and foremost idea here is to remember that news, whether that's the New York Times as a newspaper, or the Washington Post, or whatever newspaper you looked at, whether it's Fox News or whether it's MSNBC or whatever you're watching on television, whatever it is that you're using on your phone, these are all corporations. These are all corporations, and the fundamental thing is you wouldn't think it was weird if General Motors got up and said, we're going to try to make this kind of product and make cars a little bit better because we want to make money. I mean, that's how we think about how corporations work. That's how we think about how corporations operate. And somehow, some way, it's sometimes easy to look at news media or to look at just mass media generally and put them in a different box, that there's this altruistic goal of objective journalism. And I do think there's people that do work within the journalism industry, certainly, that operate within that kind of altruistic notion. But fundamentally, it's about these corporations making money. And not only that, and I think this, you look at the scope and the scale to which these corporations are owned by giant corporations. So whether it's Fox News or whether it's MSNBC or whatever it happens to be, they're giant corporations that have a whole bunch of interests in a whole bunch of different things, whether that's the stock market and finance, whether that's in actually making goods, whether, you know, that could be General Motors, that could be GE, you know, the sheer size of these corporations and the sheer fingers and tentacles that they have into different aspects of our economy absolutely impact the types of things that they're going to choose to cover and the way that they're going to choose to cover them, because ultimately it's about whether or not what they're presenting as news impacts their bottom line and impacts their financial interests much more so than whether it actually is given as information for you that's helpful.
And a simple way of saying that is it's all driven by greed.
It's all driven by greed. There is certainly a lot of that in our world and in our mass media.
The root of all evil.
So the extension of that
Well, I think that's much more of a, I don't know if everybody heard that, just the truth doesn't matter. I don't know if you're asking that as in sense of a philosophical question. But I think in the sense of what they're presenting, you're going to be certainly cognizant and filtering whatever truths that are there, or you're presenting a version of the truth, or you're ignoring other parts of things that are true in order to make sure that you're not hurting your business. Because it's much more about the business model than it is about actually making sure that you get what you need to know.
So, Pastor Dan, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand what you're saying. So what you're saying is that this is driven by a desire for profit, which is part of our economic system. And so if it comes to the question of truth, the idea is with media, the idea has never been, or at least not for a while, to present people with truth. Is to present people with a version of the world that keeps the gears of economy spinning. Is that what you're saying?
Keeps the gears of the economy spinning. I'm going to use a really dark example, but I think it's a stark example to kind of put this in perspective. Think about the Iraq War, the second one. Invaded, I think, in 2003, if I remember right, or 2004, 2003, 2000. I think it was end of 2003. There's two things to keep in mind about this as I get ready for the example of what the media started to show, is that there are corporations that made a lot of money off of that war. And maybe everybody knows that, and I'm stating the obvious, but how many tanks that got made, how many suits of body armor that got made, how many ammunitions that got made, all the transport, all the different things.
And how much oil production was ramped up.
And how much oil production was ramped up because of the fact that we were protecting oil interests in Iraq. Now think about, you get into 2004, 2005, there starts to be some pushback against the war somewhat. And at one point, I can't tell you because I'm speaking off the top of my head, but at one point they decided to make a conscious decision as a news media to stop showing the caskets of the bodies coming back. Because at one point it was, you'd see the flag draped coffins and there'd be more discussion of how many American soldiers had died. At one point it just stops. They just flat out stop showing it because it's not helpful in the sense, if you think about the war as a way to make money, and it's not helpful also from the standpoint of the news media to show that, because it's not helpful then for whatever they're saying about the war in order to continue to drive, because very well could be true. And I don't have all the exact details in front of me, but think about it. If it's, NBC News or whatever the example is, NBC very well could have owned part of the company that's also making the tanks. And so they have a vested interest in the profit they're making off of that, to not portray the war in a negative light for the sake of galvanizing and having support from the American people, because they're making money off the war. And that's ugly to say it that way, but it's the truth.
But again, what you're saying is not about one issue.
No.
What you're saying is that we're asking a question of the truth and how much somebody cares about the truth, but the goal is not to put the truth in front of you. They're not like a teacher or a pastor or someone that you hopefully still think of as someone who's responsible for putting the truth in front of you. These are corporations, and what you're saying, Dan, is that their job is to keep putting a version of the world in front of you that will keep the gears of the economy humming.
Yes.
Okay.
Vaughn, you had your hand up?
Yeah, you're saying that it's about money. And I agree that most of what is guiding them is about greed, but it's not necessarily for money. Sometimes it's about power and control. Because a lot of times they will slant things so that the party that they're more interested in is going to benefit from the coverage rather than the other party that might be in power, maybe out of power. I know there was a lot of coverage about we haven't found any weapons of mass destruction. We've been doing all this, in fact, we haven't found it. And I think that was, it doesn't necessarily help their profit, but it certainly helps their political buddies get back into control.
So Vaughn's making the point about obviously just power, generally speaking, too, that there'd be an interest in the sense of what they present in terms of power. And I agree with you. And how much in our society money equals power.
But I say it may not be just power. Sometimes it's also just trying to shape the society view.
Yep.
I don't know if you've ever heard of George Soros. He is very much a society viewpoint, and is an amazing investment. That's invested billions of dollars in certain organizations to shape certain viewpoints.
So what we may be saying as a group is that it's kind of hard to tell where profits end and power begins and power ends and ideology begin, because Soros only has his influence because of the amount of money that the guy has, right? Because he's an investor is what he is. He's not a politician. So he made all his money in investing, and then he invests it in corporations that will push an ideology that he agrees with. So where does one end and the other begin? But again, when we ask the question of truth, that may be a philosophical question, and it's definitely a religious question. I'm not sure that's the first question that applies to media, because we're talking about people putting a version of the world in front of you for very specific reasons. And the idea that they would be putting what they're putting in front of you because they want you to be a well-informed, well-adjusted individual is just not very high on their list of priorities, because you're part of a farm. You're part of a plantation. They need you to spend money.
And as we talk about this, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but the pieces that this propaganda model comes from, the title of the book is Manufacturing Consent. And so, I mean, the premise behind this idea of this propaganda model is that corporate elites, yes.
But what I do like about what y'all are saying, fellows, is that this is a book that's written in part by Noam Chomsky. And he's so far left that one of the boogeymen that he wants you to be aware of is the greed of evil corporations, right? Because he's a leftist. So just to point that out, he's right, I think he's actually right. However, comma, we might want to make sure that we're also asking the question, where does money end and power begin, and power end and ideology begin, and all that? Because it's not a one-tone symphony that's being played out there right now. And whereas Chomsky, because of his political bent, might zero in on one aspect, y'all are bringing up some other aspects that are definitely probably, we could say, part of the pie, right? I mean, we could say that.
Sure.
Well, maybe this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. I'm pretty good at that. But I'm just, it runs through my mind so often, the Barna people. There was a poll that they did, I think it's been a year or more ago, to where there was a very small number, even of Christians, that look, primarily Christian, that look at the world through a biblical view. Well, if, say, 90% of the people are looking at it through a world view, to me, they're going to look at that real different than you and me and the people in this room. So I'm not quite sure where I was going with that, but it just bothers me that as Christians, we don't have our mind on that journey that we're on. We have it on what's happening in the world.
I think it's a really good point, Sharon, and whether you knew where you're going with it or not, I like it because, and Sharon's just bringing up the perspective of polls and show how much people actually will be grounded in the Bible, have a biblical view of the world. And I mean, this gets down to one of the key points about why we want to look at this in terms of how we consume mass media, is that we as Christians need to be engaged in the world, consuming the world, but we do so in a way knowing that we're purchased and won by Jesus Christ, our identity is in Jesus Christ, and we're looking forward to the day that he comes back. And so whatever we need to know today, however we consume what we need to know today, however we maybe put it down if it isn't something that's helpful for us as we live our life of faith and walk in the faith that Jesus has given us, we're doing so in a way that it, in a sense, allows us to transcend and look past some of this nonsense. But I think it's helpful for us as we think through why things get presented the way they do to us and what gets presented to us, so that we can help make a little bit more sense of how can this information then be useful for us as we then, as his disciples, go and try to talk to somebody else that is in that worldly perspective, that has a worldly view of the world, of how we can then talk about who Jesus is. We have 3 minutes left. We're not going to get into funding through advertising and the rest of the filters today. The thing I want, and I know I like giving homework, but I think you're doing this. Obviously, we're not watching clips yet here and everything like that. The thing I want you to think about this week, and just, again, I'm not asking to change your habits. Stu, you can play Sudoku again if you want, or you can get back on social media. It's up to you. But consume media however you do, but just start, again, to put your mind in the place of thinking through these ideas and fundamentally recognizing it again that what's getting presented to you is done by corporations that are much more concerned about money and power and control and other things like that than maybe they are actually about the truth. The two words that I want you to think about, and this is especially true if you're watching news media, and they're just pronouns. But if you're watching news media, think about how many times you heard the word we and they. The we in the way that it's trying to draw you in, that somehow you're a part of where they're coming from. And the they that is just this abstract, isn't given perspective, it isn't given context, it isn't saying the they is the quote from this person of this group. It's just an abstract they that doesn't mean anything. And how that's presented to you in a way to drive up your fear or to drive up your sense of, I belong to whoever the supposed we is. And that we is something that's not the body of Christ. That they is something out there that is nothing about what Christ tells us about how we should be in the world, sharing the good news of who he is. They're just abstractions that absolutely fundamentally ask us to break the first commandment and the eighth commandment, for that matter. That we put our fear and love and trust in the talking head on TV that, oh, we believe this. Okay, I feel better because I heard what they said that I like to hear. And then I'm afraid because there's this they over there that I don't fully understand. So how many times do you hear the words we and they? And we'll come back next week. You should talk quick about what you should talk quick about what you're going to do next week. Okay. Because we're taking a break from this for 1 week.
So yeah, it's just a 1 week break. I don't want to come back from Tanzania and not share with y'all that experience and what's going on with our brothers and sisters in Christ over in Tanzania. Exciting things happening in that diocese, like what we do with districts, like the Nebraska district, they call them dioceses. Okay. And so next week, I'll be sharing all about Tanzania just for that 1 week, and then we'll go right back into this study. Okay. So great. Thanks. See you next week.
Yeah, we'll be in here. Yep. Thank you much.